There were a whole bunch of people around me at the time who felt the same way. And so I never felt that I was on a crusade without anybody marching with me. Everybody I knew felt the same way about how we had to sweep away the cobwebs. But I had the legal tools to be able to figure out that there were legal impediments. It wasn't just the spirit of the times.
Sweeping away the cobwebs, updating our legal system, modernizing it so it serves everyone equally. Through their work, lawyers push for shifts in the law, for improvements. But what about advocating when you're not on the clock? Does justice advocacy end when a lawyer leaves the courtroom? I'm Jen Cannell, and this is Dear Beth, a Women in Law podcast. And joining us once again in the studio, Bree Lowenberger and Leah Howie. And along with Beth Bilson, these are the co-editors of the collection of personal letters we base this podcast on, Creating a Seat at the Table, Reflections from Women in Law. Welcome back, everyone.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Bree, justice advocacy, I know this is near and dear to your heart. You're the very first Access to Justice coordinator in Saskatchewan. Also the co-founder and director of something called Create Justice here at the U of S at the University of Saskatchewan. What type of work would you say this is?
So the objective of my work is to collaborate with community and justice leaders to improve access to the existing justice system, as well as address systemic barriers to justice, recognizing that change requires both downstream and upstream solutions.
So what's an example of a kind of person who might not have had access to justice before perhaps you got together with some people in the justice community and said, okay, we're going to help?
Yeah, so it could be someone who is trying to access the family justice system, someone who has lost a rental unit. And so there are a number of different incremental changes that are occurring to try to move the dial to transform a variety of these systems.
Well, just to get them sort of onto a level playing field with other people who kind of know more what they're doing as they're trying to fight for, okay, my tenant rights or my rights as a parent.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. And then, Leah, I know that when you're not making podcasts, quite often you're teaching here at the university. You're also the director of the Law Reform Commission of Saskatchewan. That's the big reforms. Why do you see this work as particularly meaningful right now?
Well, I think the work is always meaningful and important. And I think laws and our legal system or justice system more broadly needs to be stable, and it also needs to be responsive to our society. Our society is constantly evolving and shifting and growing over time, and so our laws need to as well. I think the work of law reform, whether that's being done by courts as they're adapting the common law, governments as they're enacting new legislation or amending existing legislation, or by independent law reform agencies, is critically important and always has been and will continue to be in a healthy democratic society.
So, Bree, gonna make some podcast history here on Dear Beth, or at least as far as this podcast is concerned. We are gonna turn the tables and do something where we normally take someone who's more of a host and we invite them to sit in the guest seat, right?
That's right, Jen. Today's special guest is none other than Beth Bilson, KC. Our very own Beth, whom we've named the podcast after, our fellow co-editor of Creating a Seat at the Table, who really needs no introduction.
Okay, but if you happen to just drop into this podcast from outer space, Leah, we should probably introduce her. You go for it.
Okay. Beth Bilson joined the College of Law as a faculty member in 1979. She served as Dean of Law, Dean of Education, and as University Secretary. She taught me labor and employment law, I think in 2007 in my third year of law school, and is actually the reason that I'm teaching at the college. So welcome, Beth, to your very own podcast.
Oh, well, it's delightful to be here.
Well, and I know that we've even had a few people who are writing to us. And if you have questions for the podcast or for Beth or anyone, createjustice@usask.ca is the way to get in touch. But I know there are lawyers who've tuned into this podcast. They've stayed with us the whole way through. And often they see their work in justice, especially in justice advocacy, as something that, okay, I do this on office time. I will keep this in the courtroom. I will keep this in the office. Why would you say that justice advocacy should spread outside those office hours?
It goes back to some of the things Leah was saying. I think in a democratic society, I think the law is an important institution. And it does move case by case. I mean, the work that lawyers do in their offices is certainly important, and representing clients in the courts and other forums is very important. But I think in order to make sure that the law is responsive, you need to look at the law in a broader context. And I think it's important for lawyers to use their skills beyond the work that they do in the office and to look at law and legal institutions and the actors in the legal system in a way that allows them to pursue change that they think is important in a broader way than they can do just on a file-by-file basis.
Is there an example you can provide of someone who has done this well?
Well, I think if you look at there are a lot of examples I think you could choose of lawyers who have really made a difference in their communities. And I think of somebody like Charmaine Panko, who is a local lawyer and mediator, among other things, has an astonishing number of children, I think 11 children, some of whom are now working with her in her legal practice as mediators. But she has always taken the opportunities that she can to teach law students dispute resolution techniques, because she thinks the legal system needs to have more opportunities for solutions that aren't judicial solutions, that come through settlements or agreements or negotiations between the parties. She's been very active in legal organizations like the CBA, bringing their voice to the things that she thinks are important changes that the legal system should make. So I think she's just one of a lot of lawyers who do that kind of work. For quite a while, I was involved with the Canadian Bar Association, which is a national organization of lawyers, and they also have provincial chapters. Often the Canadian Bar Association is seen as sort of simply a way of getting cheap car rental or something for lawyers.
Like the equivalent of CAA, but for lawyers.
Exactly. But in fact, they do a lot of advocacy work. They have sections on different legal topics: constitutional law, criminal law, corporate law, labor law, all those things. And they make something like 90 submissions a year to the federal government and agencies of the federal government on different legal topics which they see as in need of legislative reform. And at the provincial level, they do much the same thing on a smaller scale. But I think organizations like that give lawyers an opportunity to push for change that they see as necessary in the legal system.
So, Beth, do you think lawyers have an obligation to be advancing or advocating for justice to try and change systems?
Well, I think the legal system is inherently evolutionary. I think in a common law system, it's always changing. And I think lawyers do have an obligation to make sure that that change is as consistent as it can be with what is taking place in society at large. There was a time when people viewed the law as a kind of self-contained system that had nothing to do with society, that it was some kind of scientific process that led to ever more perfect legal principles. But I think now people recognize that law is very conjoined with society and that they have an influence on one another. And I think that it is incumbent on lawyers to be attuned to that and to do what they can to bring the legal system into sync with changes that are taking place in society, and also use their knowledge of the law to speak up for social change that they think may be important.
Speaking of justice advocacy, Beth, you had a really incredible opportunity recently to sit down this person who is internationally recognized in justice advocacy work.
Yes, I had the privilege of connecting with a friend of mine, Madam Justice Rosalie Silberman Abella, a few months ago. She is Canada's longest-serving jurist, and she has championed human rights, constitutional and international law, labor rights, and more throughout her illustrious career. She was the chair of a very influential Royal Commission on Employment Equity, which really influenced the course of our understanding of the idea of equality under the Canadian Constitution. As a Supreme Court Justice, Madam Justice Abella helped decide some of the country's most consequential cases, including an opinion that paved the way for the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2004. Here is some of our conversation. It is an honor, and we thank you for joining us, Justice Abella.
Thank you, Beth. It's wonderful to see you, and I would never pass up the opportunity to have time with you. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, we're very grateful to you for participating in our podcast. So we know that lawyers develop skills of advocacy, and those are important in the courtroom in terms of creating social change. That's one of the forums in which lawyers can assist in changing society. But I wonder if you could comment on whether it's important for lawyers to exercise those skills in other venues than the courtroom in order to bring about social change.
Well, I think you make a very good point. Lawyers do affect change. Judges write decisions, but we write decisions based on arguments that are brought to us by lawyers. They do it through court cases, as you say, by making the arguments, by finding the cases and developing the arguments that end up affecting the whole country. But, you know, the gift about being a lawyer is that those are portable skills that you can and I think should take in every part of your life. If you are somebody with a commitment to Indigenous rights, gay rights, human rights, even corporate law. I mean, there is need for reform in every area of law because law doesn't stand still because times don't stand still. So the people we always rely on are the people who have, through their legal education, developed the capacity to think through an argument and bring the best evidence they can, the best thinking they can, and the best articulation to whatever forum they happen to be in. But I think it would be a great shame if people who went to law school just said, now I'm just going to be a lawyer and that's the end of my relationship with the public around me. So you do serve the public when you're a lawyer, client by client, but you also serve cause by cause, organization by organization. I think lawyers have made such a difference in all of the developments that have made Canada better.
I wonder if you could say something about what motivates you in this regard and maybe give some examples from your experience of places other than courtrooms where you think you have pushed social change.
I wouldn't say pushed social change. When I graduated from law school, it was 1970, and Canada was on the cusp of huge change. The 1970 was when the Royal Commission on the Status of Women came out, and suddenly you had a blueprint for reforms that should take place for women in areas where there had been no change in the law for 100 years. The Married Women's Property Act, no change in childcare, we're slow on that. Women were underpaid. There were so many areas, and family law in particular is the word crucible. It was where the relationships were formed that carried into society assumptions about what women did and didn't do. There were laws preventing married women from working. I was swept into, just by virtue of timing, the revolution in opening doors for women in the 70s through clients, through the Ontario Human Rights Commission, through many, many speeches. Oh my goodness. I did a lot of speeches because there weren't a whole lot of women lawyers around in the early 70s in Ontario who were advocates, who were litigators, who were speaking out. They were mostly in private law firms. And then, of course, that carries the package of human rights generally, racial minorities, sexual orientation, persons with disabilities, Indigenous people. It all started in the 70s. And I was there. I can't take any credit for it. That happened to be when I graduated. And it happened to be current that I was very comfortable with. I can't tell you why, but it just felt right to me that the law should no longer be the antediluvian, insensitive, irrelevant set of rules that meant very little to most members of the Canadian public. So we weren't aware, for instance, of what the divorce laws were because you couldn't even get one until 1968. And then suddenly women in particular realized they got a divorce, but they might not be able to get support. They would not get a share of the family home if they didn't contribute financially. But since the law said you couldn't work if you were a married woman, and social convention certainly said you couldn't work if you were a woman, they had nothing with which to contribute to the family property. So they found themselves homeless. And of course, the Murdoch case was the one that introduced the public to how unfair the family law was. And then lawyers brought arguments to the court 5 years later and found solace in and vindication in Brian Dixon's decision, leading decision in Rathwell, when he took the dissent that Boer Alaskan had written in Murdoch and transformed it into law before we had a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So I would say timing was key, luck, because there were a whole bunch of people around me at the time who felt the same way. And so I never felt that I was on a crusade without anybody marching with me. Everybody I knew felt the same way about how we had to sweep away the cobwebs. But I had the legal tools to be able to figure out that there were legal impediments. It wasn't just the spirit of the times. And I had a husband who was 100% encouraging and believed in exactly the same things. So I didn't feel the tension. And his salary as a history professor enabled us to hire a full-time person to help with the kids and in the house, which again is very lucky, right? It was not the case for most women that they had those either supports in their husbands and the financial wherewithal to be able to find the care for their kids while they were doing whatever it was that they wanted to do. So times, luck, people, family. As an immigrant, I had no goals except to be a really good lawyer. So I wasn't training my advocacy on, will this make me more likely to get to a court of appeal, or let alone the Supreme Court of Canada. There wasn't any thought of a judgeship for somebody like me, a social activist, very public. This is not the way you got promoted to the courts in Ontario. Except Roy McMurtry decided that it was time to have more women on the bench, and I think I was the only one he could find. But he was very brave and appointed me when I was 7 months pregnant with our second son to the family court bench. I mean, it was a package of many things that came together and allowed me to get into a groove that I was already comfortable in. And I just kept going. How did you do it?
Well, that all sounds quite familiar. My graduation from law school was a bit later than that. I graduated in 1977, but I certainly can recall the wave of enthusiasm about changing the framework and changing the way that the law operated in respect of people who had been marginalized. And I was one of the beneficiaries, I guess you would say, of the 1968 Divorce Act, in that I did get a divorce fairly shortly after that and faced some of the issues that you mentioned, because I had a small child and being a single parent was something of a challenge. So that the kind of escape that the Divorce Act seemed to offer really kind of created new challenges for women. But I think that sense that the law needed to be changed and society needed to take a different approach to marginalized communities, I think was very strong at that time. Do you have any advice for young lawyers? Some of our audience have been asking about what they can do in terms of advocacy, how they can get involved in supporting causes that they are sympathetic to. And I wonder if you have any advice about what they might do.
I have a rule, and that is to tell people not to take advice from anybody. It's just because if I had taken people's advice, people told me don't go to law school, girls aren't lawyers. And they told me don't be the family court judge because you're too young and one day you could be on the federal trial court. Who knows? You've got so much potential. Don't do the Royal Commission. It's going to be very controversial. They were right. Don't do the labor board. It's an administrative tribunal. Nobody in the profession takes those seriously. So I just did what I felt sounded like a really good, interesting, important thing to do. And it made me think that your best advisor is in your stomach. Like, what do your guts tell you about whether something is a good idea or a bad idea? So if there's an area that you're interested in, if there's a cause that you're committed to, if there is an organization you want to help, go for it. I think the world needs lawyers. They need good, humane, compassionate, articulate, committed lawyers everywhere. The only thing that I would urge is whatever you do to retain the civility and integrity that leaves people feeling confident about the profession as a legitimate professional body. I mean, we sometimes get so wrapped up in our causes that we forget to respect the dignity of people on the other side. Civility is so important in our profession, just so that people look up to the profession, and they should, but they won't if they see us as just street brawlers who say what everybody else says and with the same kind of screaming and yelling that really makes people shut down rather than actually exchange ideas. But there's no wrong cause to join. If you care about it, it's the right thing to do.
When you look back over your career, we have mentioned a couple of the things that you've been involved in the course of this interview, the Royal Commission on Employment Equity, for example, and some of the rulings from the Supreme Court. Is there any contribution that you have been particularly pleased about or proud of?
Well, which of your children do you like better? There's nothing I haven't been proud of. I didn't do anything unless I was proud of it, unless I was proud to see it go public. No decision, nothing. Other than my family, which to me is what I am proudest of. Because Beth, when we did what we did, I didn't know any other mothers when we had our first son in 1973 who were practicing lawyers, who were litigators. I didn't know how it was going to work out and just kept my fingers crossed. They're now 50 and 47. I'm still keeping my fingers crossed. But that's what I feel best about the family unit. My husband and I were able to create. I guess I'd have to say that the piece of thinking and writing that I did that I feel proudest of was the Royal Commission, because it was called the Royal Commission on Equality in Employment. And it was the instigation, I think, largely of women's groups who wanted affirmative action in Canada. And the government kept going to business groups and saying, what do you think about this? And they said, it's not a good year. It was never a good year to have affirmative action. So they did what governments do, and when they can't figure out what to do with the problem, they created a Royal Commission. And it was Lloyd Axworthy's initiative, and he gave it to me, a provincial court judge. It was a federal Royal Commission, 37 years old, and 1 year and $1 million to look at the barriers in employment for women, Indigenous people, persons with disabilities, and visible minorities. And there had been no definition in Canada of equality, because in 1983-84, the equality provision, Section 15, had been put on hold and not implemented until 1985. So all we had were the American decision and some low Court of Appeal decisions on their assessment of Section 15. And those decisions tended to mimic the American jurisprudence in the 14th Amendment. And I traveled across the country and met with the four groups and business and labor. And two things emerged. One, nobody liked the term affirmative action and nobody understood what it meant. So I changed it to employment equity, because It was Canadian, and I didn't like quotas, which is what the American system was based on. And the other thing was nobody really knew what equality meant because the American system is based on rights of individuals. So I thought that's not the way to go in equality. And I spent a month writing the 18 pages trying to figure out what equality meant. The rest of the report was 280 pages. I did it in 2 months. No problem. It was kind of in my head. But the equality, reading Bentham and Aristotle and Locke and Hume and all of the American jurisprudence, I figured out what I didn't like by reading things that everybody else had accepted as the Aristotelian model, to treat people the same. And I knew from traveling across the country, people weren't the same. What women needed was different from what persons with disabilities needed, which was entirely different from what Indigenous people needed. And that was different again from what racial minorities needed. They experienced inequality differently, and they needed different measures. And so I proposed a new approach to equality, which no other country had done or suggested, which was that you take people's differences into account and accommodate them so that there's nothing arbitrary like a stereotype that gets in the way of their access to the mainstream. So the accommodation of differences so that people can be treated as equals rather than forgetting that there are differences and treating everybody the same. When the Supreme Court did its first case in Andrews on equality and adopted the definition of discrimination and equality that I had written in the Royal Commission, it was a very moving moment for me when I read the decision because it was about a lawyer who couldn't practice law because he wasn't a citizen in British Columbia because the Law Society Act said you had to be a citizen. Well, my father, when we came to Canada in 1950, was a lawyer. He had a master's from Jagiellonian Law School in Poland and practiced with the Americans in Germany, but wasn't allowed to practice in Canada because he wasn't a citizen. So the fact that they used my words to strike down the provision that had kept my father from practicing law was really quite moving because he died a month before I finished law school and never got to see any of my career.
Well, thank you very much for participating in this way in our podcast. I think we can be very honored to have someone of the stature in the legal community and someone with the kind of insight and background that you have to offer some comments in relation to the issues that still face women in the legal profession. So thank you very much.
And thank you for thinking of me, Beth. It's a wonderful project. I'm not surprised that you were the one who conceived the idea. You have always been there as a cheerleader for young lawyers, for the legal profession, for women, for making sure the barriers come down. And it's an honor for me to be able to have this conversation with you. So thank you.
That was some of Beth Bilson's conversation with former Canadian Supreme Court Justice Rosalie Abella. And Bree and Leah, just what were you thinking about and feeling as you listened to that?
I felt inspired. I think that's the overarching word I would use. It was just what a remarkable career and her influence. And I learned actually more about her career listening to that interview too. So it sparked some curiosity in me. I kind of called Bree right after because we usually debrief these things when we're hearing things. We like to call and chat about things. One point that stood out to me was she mentioned her partner, her husband, and what a role he had in being supportive for her so she could achieve what she needed to achieve. And one thing that kind of came to mind when I started thinking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her partner and what a similar role he had for her. And I think it's important to think about the role of partners that we choose. If we're going to choose a partner, and you don't need to choose a partner, but if you're going to choose a partner, I think women particularly have to choose wisely and choose well. And obviously she did, but that made me just think about that is the role of partners and other people around us in our own careers and our own success.
And just touching on that, it's funny because I hadn't even thought about the divorce laws not existing. This is all before our time. What do you mean? It was that hard to? Yes, it was. But also, it sort of made me think there are so many women who we go through life trying to do it all ourselves and having the support of the people around you. And it might not be a romantic partner. It might be family. It might be somebody else. But you need that if you want to push to a bigger level or push where you're going career-wise. And I really started to understand that a little better just listening to you two talking, Beth.
Yeah, and in my conversation with her, I did mention that I was a early beneficiary, if that's the appropriate term, of the Divorce Act in the early 1970s. What I didn't say was that I also married a history professor after that who played the same role in my life. I mean, he was very supportive of my going to law school and all of the things that I did after that. And I agree with Leah. I think it was vitally important to being able to be confident that I could have a family life that operated very well and that I was able to do the things I needed to do.
Especially if kids are in the mix. I mean, honestly, what were you thinking about as you heard this, Bree?
I was struck by a number of things, also inspired, made me curious, and also made me reflective in terms of some of the family justice related work that she touched on and the great strides that have been made to improve the family justice sector, but how we need to continue working so diligently to keep moving forward. Canada, and Saskatchewan in particular, is just so plagued with domestic violence disproportionately in our province in particular. And so in thinking about, what my role and this kind of wave of the movement needs to address, it seems to me that there's a lot of work that needs to be done for partners to not be able to get that divorce, but to be safe in doing so.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny how things go in waves. And I could sort of feel as I was hearing the two of you talk, Beth, like the wave of like yes, we can change this starting late in the 60s, but really ramping up in the 70s into the 80s. And we've seen different waves of feminism kind of come. And then I would say over the last 10 years, especially since about 2016 or so, it just feels like it's so much harder sometimes to push for anything that's outside of what you just have to get done right now. And I sort of want to pick up on that idea of advocating for people who historically suffer injustice because of the way our justice system is set up. And Madam Justice Abella touched on fighting for women. She was championing same-sex marriage rights. And Bree, I understand you have another piece of tape you'd like us to hear?
Yes, this is the voice of Eleanore Sunchild. Eleanore is an Indigenous Cree lawyer who represented the family of Colton Boushie. And just to remind our listeners, Colton was a 22-year-old Indigenous man from the Red Pheasant Cree Nation who was fatally shot on a rural Saskatchewan farm by the farm's owner, Gerald Stanley. Now, Stanley stood trial for second-degree murder and for a lesser charge of manslaughter and was ultimately acquitted in February 2018. Here's what Eleanore had to say about her justice advocacy in that particular case.
It's very important for lawyers to advocate outside the courtroom because inside the courtroom, you're constrained to certain issues of your case. So you're bound by what's happening in your case before the court. There's certain things that you can't say in a courtroom that you can say outside of a courtroom. Of course, a lawyer also always has to be respectful. But in my advocacy, when I am advocating for Indigenous people, I am respectful. I also am truthful, and I speak sometimes very strongly against the systems that exist. So I remember standing outside the courtroom in Battleford after the Gerald Stanley verdict, where he was acquitted. And I remember looking at the courthouse crying because I have children. I have 3 Indigenous boys who that sadly could happen to in the province where I live, or even in the country where I live. So for me, my advocacy is not just for Colton or anyone else that I speak for. It's for my family. It's for my community. It's for my nation. It's for my people. It's a role that I've been given as a Cree lawyer, but also as a Cree Indigenous woman, is to advocate for our people. It's a role that was handed down to me by my grandfather, by the elders in my community. They told me, you have been given this education, you've been given a voice, you need to use it. You need to use it to tell the truth for our people. So that's what I do.
That's Eleanore Sunchild, and she, of course, was the lawyer for the family of Colton Boushie. And Beth, Leah, Bree, as we're all listening to this, what really rings true for you with what Eleanor is saying?
I think for lawyers, it's important to realize that they do have to operate within the constraints of the justice system. And I think Eleanor made that very clear, that when you're in the courtroom, there are certain rules and conventions that you have to observe. At the same time, I think lawyers are trained to take a critical perspective. They're thinking about how the law might change, how their arguments might push the law in a particular direction. And I think that bringing that critical capacity to bear is really important. And I think that Eleanor illustrated that. I mean, there are a lot of things about the justice system that are not sympathetic to the needs of Indigenous people. And I think she is clearly aware of that and aware that she needs to say what she has to say and that she may have to do it outside a courtroom.
And it sounds like her family, going back quite a ways, is saying, hey, look, you're smart. You have this education. You have a voice. Now you need to use it. They're making it very clear that they expect her to be an advocate inside and outside the courtroom.
And that really reminds me of comments we heard on episode 3 from Lauren and Courtney and Jordan and Faye. And all 4 of those women, I think, spoke about what an incredible responsibility, or the weight of that responsibility, when you are someone from a potentially more marginalized community, having to advocate on behalf of your community, and what an extra load that is for them to carry. So I immediately started thinking about them in that episode, and I started thinking about, our students too. We have lots of law students who are currently navigating the pressures of law school, but also the pressure of knowing they are going to be that person for their community, for their family, who is going to be expected to do that work. Like, I think Jordan talked about being known as Norman's girl in her community.
Her grandpa, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
It is a thing when your family is saying, look, we expect this of you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I've got some obligations here to live up to. All right, I'm going to go do it.
Mm-hmm.
But with that also comes the support of your family and the love of your family. Like, you're tied in, and they have clarified for you, here's your role.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking a lot about both the responsibility that she's carrying and also the privilege, I guess, that you're speaking about too, and having that support behind you is powerful.
I was also taken back to previous episodes, specifically with Rachel Lowen Walker and her thoughts on moving from allyship to being an accomplice, and reflecting myself on how can I be that accomplice and how can I encourage others.
Well, and this is where the personal journeys of lawyers, like the people we've had on this podcast, are so cool. And hearing them decide how they're going to take that next step, or like thinking about Eleanor coming out of court that day with tears in her eyes, like the right thing didn't happen for her side. They absolutely wanted to have Gerald Stanley found guilty of murder, and that just didn't happen within the laws and the constraints and the way that everyone saw it that day, and how heartbreaking that is. But she keeps on pushing. And yeah, I guess for me, hearing the sort of the backstories of what was happening, that to me tells me so much. And this is also where I think, Leah, you have some tape from lawyers who are trying to kind of push things and keep pushing things through their careers and taking them to new heights.
I do. As you've commented on, it's really interesting listening to the personal journeys of lawyers who have decided to take next steps in their careers to make justice or systemic work a full-time occupation. So right now, we're going to have a listen to Nicole Sarauer, who currently serves in the Saskatchewan legislature as the MLA for Regina Douglas Park. She is also the opposition critic for Justice, Corrections and Policing and Labor, and House Leader. In addition to all of that, Nicole is also the mother of 2 toddlers and a lawyer as well.
access to justice was my motivating factor to run in politics. It was the catalyst for me, my passion toward, in particular, access to justice, access to legal services for those experiencing gender-based violence was something that really motivated me. I worked at Pro Bono Law Saskatchewan. We provide legal services to unrepresented individuals. We had tons of people coming through. I did mostly family law. We saw a lot of women, a lot of new Canadians, language barriers, a lot of violence in the home, that sort of situation. That motivated me to get more interested on the systemic end of things. Why were we seeing so much of this? Why is violence so prevalent in Saskatchewan? That sort of thing got me more motivated to do some more work, both first internally within the Ministry of Justice, but then I also got more interested in politics, and through that met a few MLAs, and they motivated me and encouraged me strongly to consider politics. It's not something I had ever considered before. Always interested in politics, but not something that I ever saw for myself while I was in law school. I firmly believe in the importance of diversity at decision-making tables, and particularly the lack of diversity in politics is a problem, not just in Saskatchewan, but across Canada. And eventually decided that I needed to not just talk the talk, but walk the walk and do the vulnerable thing and put my name forward for nomination and candidacy. I was fortunate enough to win my nomination and then the general election the first time I ran in 2016. Never would have expected this is the path I would have taken, but feel so grateful that I've had this opportunity.
And that is Nicole Sarauer, member of the Legislative Assembly for the New Democratic Party, representing the riding of Regina Douglas Park.
And it's funny when she said, I realized I had to do the vulnerable thing and put my name forward. I'm like, oh, that is the jump that so many of us don't take. Just thoughts on why it is important to be vulnerable sometimes and to jump in even when you're not sure where that journey is going to take you as you try to make access to justice better.
I couldn't help but think of the Desmond Tutu. I love quotes, so I couldn't help but think of the quote, "If you're neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor." And as legal professionals, we are in positions of incredible privilege and power. And with that privilege and power comes responsibility. As Beth has said on previous episodes, it's not about tackling everything, but something to do something good with that privilege and power.
Yeah, I wrote down lots of little comments there listening to Nicole. I guess your question was, why is it important to let your passion for justice propel you? I think what's interesting to reflect on from Nicole's comment is that her passion for justice got her over that fear of taking a risk. And I think there's something important to think about there in terms of finding what you're passionate about and letting that be the thing that allows you to be vulnerable and take risks. And we know, generally speaking, women tend to be less or more risk averse than men, and we often don't do things because we're scared of risks. So I think the lesson from Nicole there for me was find that passion and lean into it and take those risks. And I think that was really powerful.
I think some of us fear the repercussions. Well, what if I put my name out there and then suddenly everybody knows I'm an NDP lawyer? What if somebody suddenly knows that this is how I see the world? How do you reconcile that?
Well, I think that the law, people who practice law, people who are in the legal profession, I think it is a profession where people do hold different opinions and people do have different political views. And the whole legal process is a way of dialoguing and debating those views and deciding on what the best course forward is. And that's essentially what the judicial process is about, is hearing different views on a legal issue and then deciding what the best outcome will be. And I think for lawyers, it shouldn't come as a surprise that people have different views, and they shouldn't feel exposed or embarrassed because they put themselves forward as having a particular view. I think that they don't conduct themselves as neutrals when they're acting as lawyers, and therefore, if they take a role on a particular issue, publicly, I think that's really just a continuation of the same thing. And I think, as Madam Justice Abella said, that there are many different ways of coming at social change, and lawyers can find the one that suits them and that they feel comfortable with. Although I think, as Nicole points out, they shouldn't feel too comfortable. I think they should realize that they are engaged in really what is a political process.
Well, it's inspiring, and I keep thinking about things. And as always, thank you for the conversation. Thank you to Beth. Thank you. And thank you, Leah. Thank you, Bree. It's wonderful being here at the table with you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bree Lowenberger, Leah Howie, and Beth Bilson are the co-editors of Creating a Seat at the Table, Reflections from Women in Law. I'm Jen Cannell, and you are listening to Dear Beth. It is time for our letters segment. And Beth, I see you've brought in a special guest to help us out today.
I have. Today we're joined by Jamesy Patrick, who's a colleague of mine at the University of Saskatchewan College of Law. Welcome to the podcast, Jamesy.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Well, and I know that you've focused on child protection and advocating for children and families. I'm pretty sure I read one of your articles in the Star Phoenix and the Leader Post not so long ago. One of them, you raised this sort of startling fact for a lot of people that right now there are more Indigenous children in government care than there were even at the height of the residential school system. And I kind of wonder, okay, what drew you to this particular area?
Yeah, I kind of stumbled into this area of law, as I think people kind of do. I had no idea. I knew child protection existed when I was in law school, but there was no dedicated class. I, didn't really know what it meant to work in that area. And then I just happened early on in practice to work on one file. And at that point in time, I was kind of surprised at how it was being handled and surprised at kind of the circumstances families were facing in Saskatoon in general. And then that kind of sent me down this path, which has been a very indirect path in law to where I am now.
So thumbnail sketch, what happened in that case?
What happened was I saw this massive injustice for a mom, actually. Even though I was working on the side of the ministry, it was a farm out file, I saw that really the issues weren't so much about whether she had the ability to parent, but they were issues around housing, issues around chronically facing things like domestic violence or interpersonal violence. And they were really resource problems and less legal problems.
So that is sort of what made you go,
Yeah. And then I thought, you know what, I kind of want to go back and research in this area. So that pulled me back to the university to work on, my master's was looking at child welfare, but also kind of how do we get Indigenous children's voice back into our systems. And in that, I came in with the idea thinking, I'll find kind of some solutions. I think I left that feeling more like I had identified problems and not so much solutions, but saw maybe a path on how we could kind of start supporting families better. And in that, going to your point about numbers of kids, there's more kids in Saskatchewan in placements or in care or in state care than at the height of the residential schools in Canada. I mean, part of that is population growth.
Yeah, we're a little bigger than we were through much of the 1900s.
Yes, much bigger. So there's that factor. But the reality is in some ways we've kind of taken residential school systems, moved then to kind of 60 scoop systems, and now are kind of dealing with, the hangover of that. And that's found its way into our child protection systems that, need to be worked on, really.
So our episode today really is trying to make the case for lawyers exercising their time and energy and skills to make changes in systems and organizations, both inside and outside the courtroom. So do you think that lawyers have that kind of role, or that they should play that kind of advocacy role even when they're not appearing in front of a judge?
I love this because it is exactly what lawyers should be doing. And it's kind of what we need to be thinking about in law schools and legal education. So much of kind of the ideal of being a lawyer, I certainly had a bit of this coming into law school. I mean, I'd come from a dance degree, so I didn't really know what I was getting myself into at all. But I had these ideas, it was going to be kind of the TV version of a lawyer, right? I was going to go into court. I might work for a big firm. I'm going to make lots of money and I'm going to represent clients and do a really good job. Lawyering to me is less about that. And I think we're seeing that more in legal education. And it's more about that community responsibility. And to me, advocacy goes way beyond that work. We need lawyers in big firms, and that's important too. But we really need people, boots on the ground, who can advocate, promote social change, work in organizations in kind of the less traditional lawyer style. And so I think this is an amazing opportunity, and we're seeing that shift.
Well, and this is where I want to pick up on something that Madam Justice Rosalie Abella mentioned when she was talking with you earlier, Beth. She was describing justice reform as sweeping away the cobwebs, which is kind of a great metaphor. The thing is, when you look at systems like the child welfare system, which relates also to housing and domestic violence and so many facets of life, how easy is it to change something when the injustice seems so entrenched?
So I kind of think of it, sometimes our systems, and most of them are pretty reactionary, right? So we see a flight of slippery stairs and we put, an ambulance driver at the bottom and we wait for people to fall down, and then we spend this energy and resource picking up the pieces. And the legal system in some ways kind of does that. And so this idea of justice reform it's similar to cost avoidance. It's what are the things we can do or programs that we can support that we don't wait for people to fall down. We're kind of thinking before that, what do families need to succeed? And maybe they need a mediator, or maybe they need resources through one of our incredible kind of community partners that we have in Saskatoon that do this work every day with families. How do we get information to groups of people who need it to kind of feel comfortable in accessing legal resources? And I think that's where there's such an opportunity to put energy. And I think the people that are the most impacted positively when we do that are people who face the biggest kind of social injustices or systemic bias or racism in our communities.
So we've heard from a number of lawyers on this episode of the podcast who advocate for justice in various ways. It may be through nonprofit organizations or legal organizations or their own activities of various kinds. But what about those who don't? I'm curious about what you think might discourage lawyers from working towards social change and reform.
I think sometimes it's fear of the unknown. Like, why would we change the system that we've always had? Or, we need law firms, or we want to kind of maintain control of this ideal of what it is to be a lawyer. And I think that's sometimes what discourages lawyers from wanting to work on that stuff. I also think, though, that in legal education, we're seeing that shift. And so I think future forward, law students and people leaving law school see that there's kind of a big range of stuff that they can be doing. They don't have to be that kind of stereotypical lawyer. There's a whole bunch of things that they could be doing. And so I think I see that shift. I haven't been teaching for very long, but I've seen it in the last 7 or 8 years, the shift from students kind of thinking more creatively about what it is they want to do. A lot of people, I think, enter the profession with an idea, maybe they want to be a lawyer, but they do want to help people, right? Most people come to law school with the idea of advocacy or
They want to be a lawyer and they want to help people.
They want to help people. And so I think really narrowing in on that, like, what does that mean? And being reflective in your legal education and being reflective as a lawyer, like, what is it that I'm giving back to the community? And so encouraging that energy, I think, pushes us forward to more kind of community-based programs or lawyers doing different things, sitting on boards or engaging with non-for-profits or creating some awareness around that.
I kind of look at it like there are so many hours in the day. X amount of hours may be spent working in the office, being in a courtroom. is there a certain amount of burnout that lawyers hit and they go, I can't sit on yet another board. I cannot run for office?
I see that with mostly women, to be honest. Like my women colleagues or cohort that I graduated law school with. And I look at the boards that I sit on and I go, wow, these are all women and they're all women with kids and some of them are single moms. And, you know, they're kind of taking this load on. Like women kind of take that load on. I once heard someone say, you know, if you want something done, ask a busy mom. And I, you know, kind of pissed me off because I was like, let's bring in everyone into this conversation.
Yeah, when do we ask the busy dad?
Yeah. So there is a level of burnout and, you know, you have to be able to say no to certain things. But if you build those networks, like now I kind of am getting to the point where I know who to ask and when to ask for help on some of this stuff. Like, you should come in on work on this board, or like, do you have capacity for that? And learning myself to say, I don't actually have time for that. I still struggle with that most days.
But try these people. They might.
They might, yeah.
And I think your previous question was about how easy is it to bring about change. And I think the answer is it's not easy at all. But if there are a lot of people working on it, it's amazing what you can accomplish. I mean, it's kind of like an anthill. Every little ant is not going to change the world, but you really need to have a lot of people involved. And as Jamesy says, preferably not place the entire burden on one part of the community.
On all the mama ants.
Right.
Well, this is the point where I'd like to reach into the mailbag and just see some of the responses, questions that our audience has been writing in about. And if you remember back in episode 3, we were talking about allyship, being this accomplice to people who are in underrepresented groups, especially at work. And Beth, I understand our letter today kind of relates to that.
It does. Today's letter is from a friend of the podcast, Jocelyn Pelletier-Huntley. Jocelyn is a 2021 Vanier Scholar, a professional engineer, a diversity and inclusion research consultant, facilitator, and speaker, and founder of Prairie Catalyst Consulting. And Jocelyn was actually a former student of mine, and I'm a committee member for her PhD, which focuses on activating workplace allies. She writes, "Hi, Beth. As someone who works in DEI with a focus on advancing women and underrepresented people in the workplace, particularly in the male-dominated fields of engineering and mining, I'm wondering how you think other professions, aside from law, can make a difference in supporting equity."
That's Jocelyn Pelletier-Huntley, founder of Prairie Catalyst Consulting. She focuses on the whole idea of leading and inspiring positive change so workplaces can better serve all of us. All right, what are we going to tell her?
Oh, wow. I mean, that would be an incredibly challenging. I mean, engineering, I think, has historically been pretty male-centric, right? So amazing for her to be doing that work. I think it's having conversations and bringing people into those conversations. And so one of the things I've been talking about a little bit with some of the community work that I do is, how do we get interest in that? Like, how do we create an environment where people want to even have a conversation about some of these issues? I mean, it's something that's come up with Elizabeth Fry Society, which I'm on the board of, and it's something that's come up with working alongside First Nations and in particular the FSIN. Like, how do we bring people in? And I think it's not so much, at least in the work that I do, not so much blaming, like, ministry, you're not doing this thing, or government, you're not doing this thing, but trying to create awareness so people are encouraged to have conversations. It's difficult to do. There's a certain finesse to creating that space where people don't feel maybe attacked or feel belittled or put down, but they feel like, yes, let's have this difficult conversation.
Here.
Yeah,
we want you here. We're not just going to snipe at you on Twitter or X or whatever the heck Elon Musk wants to call it this week. We're not just going to snipe at each other and look for ways to lash out. Because I do see a certain amount of that sort of filtering into the public conversation, and I guess looking for ways to invite people. Okay, let's talk about, say, in dentistry, in medicine, in engineering, and so many different parts of our lives. How do we bring them in?
Yeah.
I think, going back to one of the earlier points that Jamesy made, a lot of this is not really about law as such. I think because of the particular role that lawyers play and the legal system plays, a lot of the conversation about equity and diversity has taken place in the context of law and legal institutions. But I think it's a social issue, and it involves all of the professions, all of the occupations, all of the people who are involved in those organizations. And I think, to answer Jocelyn's question, I think the kind of response that those professions can make, her work is a good example of that. That is just identifying the fact that there are issues in the engineering and mining fields and engaging people in some kind of effort to address that, I think is really a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and we do better when we have a more diverse field. Like, we do so much better. And it's really interesting when you think about the equity question and diversity question, because when you look at the profession and like taking law, for example, I mean, we still, in kind of those big firms, we still have primarily white males in positions of kind of authority or power. But when we bring in that change and have that diversity, we do better for our clients. We do better for community. We do better because we have such a diverse voice in those spaces. And to me, that's the part that's exciting. If we can get past the kind of power dynamic there that happens, and we can bring those people in, there's so much more opportunity to be creative. Like, I was recently at this board meeting, and, I had a kind of very clear perspective on what we were going to be talking about and the solution we were going to get to, until I heard someone else's voice, and I was completely swayed in that. And without that diverse perspective, the decision that we would have made probably would have been a poor one, the one that I would have made.
Well, and just bringing in the white guys, making sure that we're not trying to leave you out. We want to bring it in, but we want to make this table bigger. We need all the ants, not just some of them leading us.
And I think Jocelyn's work is a good example of the need to be intentional about it. I mean, her work involves training for people in engineering and mining organizations. And I think that it's a good example of this is a conversation that you need to have overtly. I mean, you can't just depend on people's goodwill and assumptions about how people are going to behave. There has to be actually an open discussion, because often we just carry on and make assumptions about how things work without really deliberating on it.
Absolutely. And I also think that you kind of hear rumblings of this. I heard some rumblings of it kind of in the education part of an institution like the university, where there's this like fear, where is the space for white men? Like, there's this kind of attack, and guess what? The pendulum is swinging, and so be it. Like, there's space for everyone at tables. And like, I'm kind of disinterested now on I don't know if you call it the like sensitivity around that. Like, I'm kind of disinterested in engaging in that conversation. You're at the table, you're welcome at the table. This is not about us versus them or us versus white men, but it is about, to me, having all of those people have an equal space. I kind of feel unapologetic now about some of that
Absolutely.
stuff. I'm just kind of like, yeah, the pendulum has swung and there's space for everyone at these tables, and no one has to be apologetic about this.
Isn't the provincial motto, we're stronger together? Something about that? From many people, so much strength. So yeah, thank you so much for coming in today. And that's our letters segment. Jamesy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. This is a great conversation and an important one.
Jamesy Patrick's an assistant professor in the College of Law here at the University of Saskatchewan. And Beth, once again, how should listeners get in touch with us?
If you have a question for us, or maybe something on the show caught your ear, drop us an email at createjustice@usask.ca.
Thank you so much, Beth. Catch you next time. That's it for this episode of Dear Beth. We record and produce this podcast on Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional and ancestral territory of the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, it's also the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to our First Nations and Métis ancestors, and we are grateful to be able to have these conversations and to be able to hear these stories on Treaty 6 territory. We do this while we're recognizing our own privilege, and we're mindful of how we can use this podcast to make sure diverse voices get a platform. We draw inspiration from Maria Campbell's observation that stories are a way that we can talk to each other without having barriers between us. Our team at Dear Beth is Leah Howie, Bree Lowenberger, and Beth Bilson. Hannah Jorgensen's our associate producer, and Wayne Giesbrecht is our tech. We produce this podcast in partnership with the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan. Dear Beth is a production of Cascade Communications. I'm Jen Cannell. Thanks for listening.